Welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous, podcast alone.
I'm your red, white, and blue host, Madelyn.
I'm your star-spangled host, Emma.
And welcome to this side quest edition of Talk This. Happy 4th of July, listeners.
Yes. By the way, if you can hear raining sounds from my side, that's because it's raining.
Yeah, it's definitely raining in Boston on the 4th of July.
It probably is, yeah.
Maybe it is.
I am hopeful that it will be raining this evening so that there will be at least less fireworks.
It's ambient sparkler sounds in the background that you're hearing from Emma, not rain.
Exactly.
She just has a few sparklers going on throughout this entire show, just to celebrate
I did
America's
say I was
B-Day.
star-spangled. Did not say I was burning myself alive.
So, this week, I can't remember if I said this on a show, or if I just said it to you.
I think you said it at the end of last show.
Well, it wasn't that smart of me to come up with a topic.
Yeah.
So, this week, we are going to be talking about America in games. That's pretty broad. So, I'm going to start off with a list of every video game set in America.
No.
Here we go.
No, don't do it.
I'm just kidding. But in honor of American Independence Day today, we figured, talk this. Been roasting ourselves lately for doing side quests like 6 weeks after they're relevant. Let's do one on the day. On the holiday.
Yeah.
Can't help myself.
Let's do it.
So we're going to be talking about, the ways that different images of America are presented in video games, the ways that video games are used as propaganda tools for various American entities and American ideas, the dopest video game presidents, and everything in between.
Yeah.
So let's start with a little history of America. So, in 1776, just kidding. Now there's a lot of different angles to cover here, but I guess I'll dive in. I'll save the U.S. Army has an esports team stuff for half an hour in.
Sure.
But let's kick it off with some light discussion of American exceptionalism and how it appears in video games.
Sure.
So, Emma, you seem to have done some academic reading about this, from what I'm seeing in our notes.
I did. I found some. They were PDFs and they were on Google, so I assume they were legal for me to read. So I did some academic reading on American exceptionalism. There was one quote that was quoted from something else in the paper that I read. It's called "Have You Won the War on Terror?" About American exceptionalism. That's like, it's not necessarily like the whole idea of it is not necessarily that we think like America is exceptional right now, but that like America uniquely has the potential to be exceptional, and has to continually strive to live up to this exceptionalism, which basically means that, we know best, and we can do best, and we are best, and that's not acceptable, because the American dream plays into it too, right? That's a similar sort of thing, that we have these great principles that our nation was founded upon that we must consistently live up to. And you see this coming across in video games, in just like specifically military games, because that's where the U.S. is most like directly like portrayed as a country, not just like it takes place in the U.S. But you see this in military games where, the U.S. Army will be, or your protagonist within the U.S. Army at least, will be portrayed as somewhat uncomplicatedly heroic, You know, they're there. They know what's best. They can do it best. They are the best. And so on and so forth. And this can, you know, it's either like they're better than whatever foreign country they happen to be fighting, or even like they're better than, you know, the corrupt establishment of the U.S. government, you know, or the bureaucrats who don't understand that the military needs to get things done or whatever. But it's the same sort of feeling of like you're the guy who can do it. So it definitely plays into like the video game power fantasy too. It matches with that.
Definitely, yes. It's definitely really simpatico, this kind of like American hero image with the power fantasy of being the protagonist in a video game, which is why probably we see it a lot. So I feel like the prototypical examples of this are like the Call of Duty series or Medal of Honor, like these kinds of like game series that emerged in the late 90s, early 2000s, and have gone through like various iterations of America winning storylines since then.
Shockingly, I'm sure this will come as a shock to everyone, but media changed a lot after 9/11. So you'll see a lot of, especially like early 2000s games that are very like rah rah kumbaya. Not just video games, right? There's a lot of stuff. I've been watching, this is tangential, but I've been watching a series on propaganda in TV shows from a YouTuber called Skip Intro. And he was talking about spooky cop shows for his most recent one. And he talks a little bit about how, like, you have the X-Files in the 90s that's pretty anti-establishment. Like, you know. And then you get to spooky cops after 9/11 that's like government-sanctioned spooky cops, like saving citizens from threats they cannot see that are all around them. It's like, gee, that sounds familiar.
Well, I also did a little bit of academic reading. Look, up front, most of the academic discussion seemingly around American exceptionalism in games is about Bioshock Infinite, which we will get to, but is also a little on the nose. Like, if you're analyzing American exceptionalism in Bioshock Infinite, like, yes, you've played the game.
Yeah.
Good. Not to knock like all scholars writing about that, right? But as I was looking for stuff, I was like, okay, come on, like, I get it. Bioshock, yes, has things to say about this. Like, can we analyze something a little broader than that? So I read an interesting paper called New American Patriotism in Games on World War II themed military shooters in the shadow of post 9/11 politics from Philip Jankowski. That kind of discussed exactly what you're talking about here. I mean, not only you're absolutely right to point out this is true, this kind of patriotic rah-rah appeared in a lot of media around this time, and these games reference that directly. You see a lot of references to things like Saving Private Ryan in imagery and that sort of thing in these types of games, because, of course, it's this kind of like driving cultural force in America in the early aughts. But basically what this author presents is, particularly in this kind of early 2000s period, you see a lot of these like shooter type games, action games that are set during World War II, which I had already been thinking about in the context of a different game that Emma brought up in our notes. So it was interesting to me to see, like, oh yes, these thoughts that I was having bear out, which is that World War II feels like kind of, I don't know if you have this kind of cultural thing baked into your brain too, but World War II feels like the last, like, non-controversial war in my brain.
I mean, I think I must have read articles that were, like, talking about that, but, I mean, it's true, at least if you keep it to Germany, right, the Nazis.
Right.
It's like, they were evil.
Yeah, look,
They were
I'm
evil
not here
people.
to defend atomic bombs or anything like that, right? Like, I'm not going to be political in that way here today. But it does feel like, when you think about, like, oh yes, fighting the Nazis, that feels like that's probably a good thing. And if we look at American wars after that, Korean War, Vietnam, various Gulf Wars, the Cold War, whatever, obviously the Cold War is not really a war. I know this. I'm not dumb. But whatever. All of those conflicts both feel like they had a much less unified support from the American public, and also in hindsight, it's like, ooh, were we really the good guy there? A lot of questions. And probably people that know a lot more about World War II are sitting in the audience being like, well, Madeline, World War II is more complicated than this. But the point that I'm making is that culturally it has gone into my brain that World War II is safer.
Yeah. I think even culturally you could say that I think it's pretty common perception of the Soviets were evil. Even if we didn't have a direct war with them.
So I'll say I feel like there's been a lot of kind of Soviet-y television. What a descriptor. I feel like there have been a lot of TV shows that deal with kind of that period, prestige-y TV shows that I haven't watched that deal with that time period recently. And so I'll agree with you with the caveat of maybe those shows have been humanizing the Soviets. I don't know.
Sure, yeah. I was reading about some ways that military shooters like take these more controversial wars like Vietnam and the Bay of Pigs. That's the Cuba thing that we did, right?
Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And like they're like, oh, but they were cooperating with the Soviets to make chemical bombs or whatever. So it's okay. They're evil. And sort of sanitizing those wars in that way so that you still get to feel uncomplicatedly heroic. I guess because we got sick of making World War II games.
That is basically what happened, I think. World War II games are kind of coming back. We can talk about that in a little bit, but definitely this article talks about kind of post 2008 or so. There's like a real fall off in the number of these that you see. But for about 7 or 8 years there's a lot of them. We see a lot of Call of Duties that are kind of around World War II, Medal of Honor, Band of Brothers. Is that something? I think that's in one of the series. He talks about some other video game series that I'm not remembering right now.
There are a lot more military shooters than I knew of, is what
Brothers
I
in
learned
Arms is what it
from
is.
doing this research.
Yeah, there are a lot of them. Who knew?
Who knew?
They haven't been games that are on in my shopping cart.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he talks about how kind of in the wake of 9/11, there's this return to like this idea of new American patriotism, which is this, this idea of like everyone comes together to put the nation ahead of the individual, which is in itself kind of not an American idea, right? But whatever. This idea of the nation coming together to do that and like defending the nation from like constant threats on the outside, and that shared experience of like brotherhood in battle, and particularly doing that kind of perpetually through World War II. And using that as kind of a lens to present this like justified violence, and making the military more visible during this time when it particularly wants to justify its actions. And that notably, of course, in these games, that the civilian toll is isolated from the player. You certainly won't be causing it, or even if you're indirectly causing it, there's nothing you could do, or you're seeing it happen, but it's as a result of something that the enemies are doing. And also other things that seem to be, like, they're so obvious when you hear them presented as an analog, but I never really thought about. Like, thinking of World War II as like, yes, this coalition of Western nations with lots of different perspectives coming together to fight this monolithic evil guy. Which is also, definitely a narrative that you could impose upon the Iraq War, particularly at the time.
Except for France.
Well, the French, right? But also the point that these games are super cinematic and, like, realistic, and that realism, as it can across all media, kind of presents the opinions and perspectives therein as also realism, right?
Yeah.
Realism, really powerful tool for propaganda in media.
Yeah. There was... So, I guess to talk a little bit about 6 Days in Fallujah, it's a game that was originally announced in, like, 2007, 2008. It was supposed to come out around then, and ended up getting canceled. Apparently it was, like, advertised as, like, a horror game in Fallujah, which sounds more interesting, at least. Although I can't imagine. I don't know if they would have done anything good with it. But now it has been re-announced as a more straightforward, like, depiction of the second invasion of Fallujah. And some of their team... Who was the guy who gave the interview on Polygon?
It's Peter Tomte.
Peter Tomte gave an interview talking about, like, they've done a lot of research, they've talked to real soldiers, and they've talked to real civilians, and you'll be playing as soldiers, and there's also a campaign where you play as, like, a father trying to get, you know, his family out of there before the fighting, or whatever. But he also says some, like, things like that they think they can talk about the human cost without portraying the atrocities, which is like, yeah, sure, war's bad whether or not there's atrocities or not, but also, like, when you're telling a story about a real event, especially one that, like, not a lot of people know about, like, you sort of take the responsibility upon yourself of, like, this is what people are going to know about this now, right? It's like, when you make a documentary, like, yeah, you can't just, like, here's all the footage I took, enjoy the movie, right? You have to edit it into some sort of narrative. But at the same time, you think about, like, what you're leaving out. I was thinking a little bit in terms of, like, you mentioned... in our 6-week side quest, like, for a much milder example, like in Sakuna of Rice and Ruin, they leave out one of the rice steps because they couldn't think of a mechanically way to do that. But, like, if I played that game, I would walk out of it being like, hell yeah, I can grow my own rice now. And I wouldn't know
that
about
is not the impression I'm getting. I'm not very good at growing rice. But yeah.
just to go in with my example, okay? But I wouldn't know about that step. But because it's been portrayed to me as, like, this really detailed thing that, like, you can learn how to do, like, that's my perception of growing rice, because I've never grown rice. And so when you're portraying a real event, you have to think about, like, what you're leaving in and what you're leaving out, right?
So to continue your very strange comparison here, though...
Do you know what I'm saying, right?
No, I do, but I want to build on it a little bit. In saying... In reading about Sakuna of Rice and Ruin, kind of researching for that show, not for the 6-week episode, I read about how people were literally telling each other online, like, the best way to get good at this is to read this rice handbook from the Japanese government.
Yeah.
And not to stereotype exactly, like, certainly, like, I'm not going to read the rice handbook. Come on, it's a video game. But I do feel like there is a certain subset of player there that, and perhaps a larger subset in the player base of Sakuna of Rice and Ruin, who would be interested in doing that supplementary research, than in the very broad and perhaps very more patriotic, not that it has anything to do with Sakuna, but whatever, then, like, perhaps the players of 6 Days in Fallujah are likely to go and be like, what really happened in Fallujah?
Yeah. Well, one helps you with the game and the other doesn't.
Yeah, so, to give some context for you, listeners who... Look, maybe listeners who are real adults would know I am a real adult. Maybe listeners who are older than me have more memories of this, and so it would be, like, less... You know, like, if you're in your 40s, maybe you actually have knowledge of what happened in Fallujah and would like notice the human rights abuses being left out. So like acknowledging that I was like 10 or whatever, less than that. So what they've chosen to leave out of the game, and they've said this was intentional, is they've left out the use of white phosphorus, which is essentially a chemical weapon that, you know, under like the international like rules of war, it's like a war crime to use.
Specifically, it's like you can use it to illuminate the battlefield or something, but if you knowingly use it on people for its chemical properties, that's a war crime. So like the US has said, yeah, we used it, but not for the war crime stuff. Is from my research I got.
And the developers here, Peter Tomte here, is like, oh, the soldiers I interviewed didn't tell me about it, so I can't put it in. It's like, my dude, come on.
Yeah.
No, I will say, I mean, look, they brought this upon themselves by making the game.
Yeah.
Right? But, like, you're in a difficult position here. And this is a difficult position. Again, I'm not saying this really with sympathy, because when you choose to make a game that's about, like, an instance of war where there are still plenty of people alive that remember it and were there, particularly, but any war, like, this is a challenge that you've taken on for yourself, and so that's just the name of the game, buddy. But if you're making a shooter that takes place in a real-life war situation, you know, probably in most real-life war situations, there are, like, war crimes and human rights abuses that happen, right? Like, that is war, unfortunately. But you are making an entertainment item, and you're making an entertainment item, like, usually, often, that's a first-person shooter, and there are, like, rules to what that is.
Yeah.
Right? And so you're in this hard place of, well, I want my game to be fun. And, like, if you're really gonna actually base it on real war, like, and grapple with that, the like fun of causing carnage in a first-person shooter does not sit well with the human consequences of that carnage.
Yeah.
And so they're in this difficult position of like, okay, if you put in white phosphorus, like, you have to make that fun.
Yeah.
You can't make it so atrocious that people are like, oh my god, what have I done here? And they turn off the game.
Yeah.
But also it's atrocious. And if you make it fun, you're gonna have, you know, video game blogs being like, what is happening here?
Yeah.
As they rightly have about kind of the discussion around this game, which they had first described as not political.
Yes. They've since backtracked on it and said, of course it's political, because of course it is. I feel like this is probably a good transition to, like, Spec Ops, but I do think it's kind of, like, a new trend in these games, because I think Call of Duty just recently did this, of, like, you've got, like, the Call of Duty stuff, but you've also got, like, the little side campaign with, like, someone who lives there, and you have to, like, escape the fighting or whatever. It's like they're trying to sort of have their cake and eat it too. You know, it's like, you're a cool soldier, but also, you know, you're a helpless civilian that must save themselves. And so, yeah, it's just, it's a way to try to figure it out that just doesn't work. But I was watching an interview from The Escapist with the main level designer on Spec Ops The Line, on 6 Days in Fallujah, in this Polygon interview in particular. And, like, he said, and I think this is what people don't understand when people say all things are political, is that both sideism is a political stance. That's not being political. That's still being political. You know, like, taking the middle ground and, like, trying to show all sides is a political viewpoint that you are showing. And that's why games like 6 Days in Fallujah can't not be political. Yeah, so if you don't know about Spec Ops: The Line, interestingly came out around the time that the 6 Days in Fallujah game was originally supposed to come out. I think like 2008.
Which, by the way, they canceled it the first time because the soldiers were not happy about it.
Yeah, well, it was a horror game, I guess. So
yeah, it's like, okay, I get it.
So Spec Ops at the time was sort of marketed as any other sort of military shooter. You're a group of 3, you go to Dubai, which is in the middle of like a sandstorm, to look into, I think, a regiment that's disappeared there, basically. And it starts out pretty normal. You know, you're doing your military things, and then you keep going, and you're like, no, this is getting weird. And the title screen starts getting sadder, and then there's a point in which, I guess spoilers, but to be honest, it's hard to go look into this game without knowing this now, but you use white phosphorus on civilians. You, the player, theoretically don't know that's what you're doing, but it is what you're doing. And then from there, your character starts to sort of descend into chaos, I guess. So Spec Ops is pretty well known for, like, people have talked a lot about it. I don't think it's not a critique of violent video games or even a critique necessarily of American military, but sort of very specifically like a critique of these military shooters genre. Of casting the player as like, you're this cool soldier who goes in and he does heroic stuff. And what Spec Ops says is like, you're this soldier who goes in and probably you make everything worse, and certainly you're not a hero in this situation. It just sucks for everybody. And so that's what's interesting about Spec Ops, is that it says basically that like, you can't make this game and be like casting the soldier as the hero, or rather it is not accurate to do so, you know. Especially as like a gamer who wants to go in for like an uncomplicated violent time but is playing around with like real stuff. You can't be like, it doesn't work, basically, is what Spec Ops is trying to say.
Unsurprisingly, Spec Ops was a commercial failure.
Well, there's a lot of things going into it. The publisher apparently was pretty hands-off, except they said you have to have a multiplayer mode. And the multiplayer mode sure is cognitively dissonant from the single-player experience. The level designer in this interview also talked about, like, he just didn't think marketing knew how to market it, and that wasn't really marketing's fault. He doesn't know how he'd market it either. But yeah, I don't know how you'd market it either.
It's just like, it does feel like this is a gameplay experience that works best with you not knowing what it is. Right?
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen people say that, and I haven't played it myself because it's only on PC available to me, basically. But like, I don't know if that's totally true, to be honest. But I think that about everything where people are like, go in as unspoiled as possible. I'm like,
okay, so that's a spoiler culture critique
yeah.
as a whole. We'll save that for another side.
That's my knee-jerk reaction when everyone's like, you should go in without knowing anything. I'm like, I'm gonna spoil myself on purpose now.
I guess my point is, if you buy into spoilers being a thing that can have a detrimental effect on your experience, like there does feel like there's a sort of a particular power to this game coming in expecting a standard war hero game.
No, I think spoilers have an effect on your experience. I just think they shouldn't have a detrimental effect.
Fair enough. we'll talk about that another day.
Sure.
But it's a marketing challenge, right? Because if you reveal what it is, well, it's like you don't hit the audience that, if you reveal what it is, the audience that you want to play it to have the like artistic effect of it is not going to play it. So you kind of have to keep it a secret so you can trick those people into changing their point of view.
To be honest, I think it mostly made a lot of people mad. It's like the whenever any game like questions the player, people are like, well, why'd you make me play it then? You know? And I always think that's a juvenile point of view.
It's The Last of Us Part 2 all over again, except 10 years earlier. Yes.
And I don't think Spec Ops is saying, like, you're bad for playing video games. It's just saying, hey, maybe these military shooters are kind of effed up.
Well, it's a response to this 2001 to 2008 period of very unproblematic World War II shooters.
Yeah.
Very realistic, unquestioned. I think probably its big sin is being a video game. Like, reading about this, I'm like, oh, that's a dope play. Right? I'm like, if that was, like, the plot of a play, that would be dope. You know? That's terrible to say. Like, war crimes, that'd be a dope play. But this kind of, like, end of Act 1 twist is so theatrical. Or even if it was a movie, right? I feel like people would be like, oh, that's awesome. Like, what a bold artistic choice. And here they still do that, but also there's an obligation for it to be fun.
Yeah.
And so you have that kind of, like, constant dissonance. Which I feel like is what, in a lot of ways, prevents even the games that come at this with an attempt at critique from being successful. Because you still have to gamify the horror somehow.
I've watched a lot of videos on Spec Ops because you can't escape it if you watch, like, game criticism videos. And they did some cool stuff with it being a game. Like, I think someone was talking about how the level design, like, you're always descending, and yet somehow you'll come out at, like, the top of buildings. And that's, like, that sounds dope. Like, that sounds really cool. That's a really cool level design choice. It doesn't make any sense, but it's great, and that's, you know, you can do that with a video game. But yeah. So I just think it's unfortunate. Yeah, I don't know.
I just don't know when gaming as a discipline is going to get to the point where there's ways to make experiences, or if it ever should get to a point where there's ways to make experiences that aren't fun. Or that have significant portions that aren't fun.
I feel like we should say, I always think of whenever I say fun in relation to video games, I always mean satisfying.
Sure, yes.
Or, you know, compulsive, I guess, or, whatever
I mean
insert
that
word here. Yeah.
Because I am pretentious and willing to engage with art. I mean that for me. But I do partially mean that especially for the people that are... I don't mean to spend this whole podcast being like, if you play Call of Duty, you're an idiot. Like, I'm sorry. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say. Like, you can play Call of Duty. But if you play Call of Duty and you've never thought about what Call of Duty is trying to say to you, about America, or about war, or about foreign people, or about American terrorists, or whatever it is, right? If you've played those games and you've never even, or if you've played a video game and you've never thought about what that game is trying to say, or if you're the person on Twitter this week who was like, aliens, not political, like wokeness is eating itself, or whatever that, like, if you're one of those people who has never interrogated the media that they watched, like, where was I even going with this? I don't know. Worked out.
Something about funness.
Oh, right. Then for you, I probably do literally mean fun, right? Because that's, like, all you care about in your game. And in some ways that, like, there is a place for that, and that's okay. Like, I'm not here to tell you your game shouldn't be fun.
Yeah.
But I do feel like something that will hold games back from ever truly successfully pushing back against this American exceptionalist idea is the large flank of white ring. That's like a Freudian slip. Right wing, capital G gamers who like don't want to critique their media and certainly don't want media that is going to be unsubtle about having problems with America.
Yeah, I feel like especially in America, but everywhere, there's like this real knee-jerk reaction to like media can cause like changes in you, right? Because so much of the time people after mass shootings are like, it was video games. He played too much DDR or whatever.
I shouldn't laugh.
I know, it's not funny. And like, no, I really don't think if you play violent video games, it like will make you go and shoot someone. I just don't. Or at least that's not the primary factor in why you would do that. But like the media you consume helps you form opinions about things and like teaches you things. And as we've talked about, if it's a topic you don't know very much about, but like the thing you're watching or playing like presents it competently, and I'm guilty of this sometimes too, you will internalize that as like, oh yeah, that's it. That's what did. That's what happened. Without necessarily going and like checking it for yourself. And again, this is sort of all media, not necessarily just video games, but and I always think it's important. And that's why you have to critique art. But because people don't want to be like, oh, you're violent because you play video games. They don't want to think about like, oh, you're friendly or you think better of the military possibly because you watch a lot of stuff where the military is good. Anyway, do we want to talk about something that's not the military? We could go to Bioshock Infinite now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just throw in there though, don't we all just want Ronald Reagan to tell us what's right and wrong?
Oh God, no. Which Call of Duty recently? Was it Modern Warfare?
Black Ops Cold War.
Cold War, that's what it has dead-eyed, freaky Ronald Reagan. I don't love it.
It's interesting, though, as a, if those World War II games are, like, the harkening back to the simpler time in the Iraq War, it's interesting to see dead-eyed Ronald Reagan come out, in this period of the, Republicans in Congress, like, ripping their faces off and being like, we care about nothing but power!
I shouldn't laugh at that either.
Right? But it's like, oh, okay, I get it. Like, yeah, like, I'll lay my cards on the table, right? Like, Ronald Reagan, also a bad guy, but at least he, like, maybe had principles about how he was bad.
He kept his human skin on in public.
I just mean it's like, you could point to things and be like, it seems like he believes that.
Sure.
As opposed to the current ilk, which is like, I don't know if I can point to very much that it seems like you actually believe.
Yeah.
Like, at least be upfront about the people that you want dead, right?
Yeah. But yeah, let's get into the absurd video games. We can talk about
so far
too.
We've mostly talked about, like, realistic depictions of, like, either real American events, like American wars, or, like, slightly, or, like, fictionalized versions, but presented as realistic, right? And where I think there is more success in, like, either critiquing American exceptionalism or at least presenting a version that I'm, like, more okay with, I guess. That's bad, right? It's fooling me in a better way to buy into it, right? Like, the military, like, the straight-up Call of Duty propaganda just, like, doesn't really work on me very well. But the stuff where it gets creative, now you can convince my intellectual brain. So let's talk about Bioshock Infinite. We can't not talk about Bioshock Infinite.
Yes. If you don't know about Bioshock Infinite, it's the other dad game that came out in like 2013, where the dad was voiced by Troy Baker. It's a follow-up to just Bioshock and Bioshock 2. It's the still the newest in the series. You play as Booker DeWitt, who is sent up to Columbia, a city in the sky, to retrieve a girl and wipe away his non-specified debt. So Columbia,
student debt, probably.
Yeah, it's probably student debt. Just sell a child, wipe away your student debt.
Look, it would be in keeping with the spirit of this game, right?
Yeah.
That he's like going up because he's like, oh, my MFA. Anyway, go on.
So Columbia is a city in the sky. You enter Columbia through being baptized, and when you rise up from the ocean, you're presented with the founding fathers as godlike statues looking down upon you. And that's basically what Columbia is. It's this, like, America taken to its, like, most extreme. It's not just the city on the hill anymore. It's the city floating in the sky, and the founding fathers are literal gods that you, like, worship and pledge yourself to, and everybody's dressed like it's the 50s. I don't know actually what year it is in Bioshock Infinite, but the aesthetic is still important. And everybody's white. At least the beginning. Like the thing that kicks off like the actual combat and conflict in the game is that Booker wins a raffle, and his prize is he gets to throw a baseball, which is great. That's pretty American too. At a interracial couple. Yay! And that's honestly about as deep as Bioshock gets in its criticism of that, though, is presenting it as absurdity. You can choose to throw the ball either at the couple or at the raffle guy, which I don't know how I feel about making that choice, to be honest. But you don't get to throw it anyway because someone grabs your arm and was like, "You're the Antichrist," and then they start attacking you. And that's sort of that is sort of how the whole like stuff goes in Bioshock Infinite. Is it has this stuff in the background, but whenever anything's happening with it, it's like something weird's going on in sci-fi, and that's sort of the main thrust of the plot by the end, rather than any interrogation of Columbia itself.
And so I'm of two minds about this. Like, on the one hand, the bar for video games that critique, even in like a satirical way, like American ideals, or that present as being like anti-racism, anti-fascism, whatever, right? Particularly in AAA games, is so low that it's like, I want to give them a pat on the back for trying.
Yeah.
On the other hand, using, like, a racist society basically as set dressing is gross.
Yeah. So, there is a little bit more to the Bioshock Infinite story. So, there's, like, the person in charge's name is, Comstock. He's like the prophet of America, basically. And then there's a rebellion force known as the Vox Populi, who's led by a black woman named Daisy Fitzroy, who are basically like rising up in rebellion against Comstock and the way that society is right now in Colombia. And like Daisy is not portrayed super positively. It basically just comes down to the thing that they're like, violence and killing people is bad. No matter who you are or why you're doing it. Which is
unless you're the hero of the game.
Unless you're Booker and you have to protect your not daughter. It was basically, I think Elizabeth, it's all spoilers, but whatever. Elizabeth ends up killing Daisy before she, like, kills, like, a young virgin of one of, like, the bad guys or something. I don't know. There's some time shenanigans and parallel world shenanigans going on in Bioshock Infinite. Because it's bad.
More games should really raise the question of if you should kill baby Hitler. Absolutely.
That's what I remember happening anyway. Well, she's trying to kill somebody, and Elizabeth doesn't want her to, so she kills Daisy. It's a lame critique. Like, sure, violence is bad. I'm not saying that people in real life should take to the streets and do some murders in the name of revolution or whatever, because I don't think that they should. But I also think that fiction, and especially fake fictional worlds, get more dramatic leeway to do stuff, right? And I do think a little bit about, like, I don't know, blowing up the reactors in Final Fantasy VII is pretty much portrayed positively throughout that whole game.
They have some worries about it, but yeah.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. They're not like, Barrett should die because he blew up some reactors or something like that. And I do think
you're right. Like, Jesse is like, oh, oops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think Bioshock Infinite falls into some, like, both side-ism of, like, yeah, violence is bad, but also one of these people is, you know, their people have been murdered by other people, and people throw baseballs at them when they get married, and stuff like that. And it's hard to be like, this is equivalent, because it's not, really.
Yeah. And look, you know, obviously, this sucks, right? But, like, our cultural awareness of some of this stuff has come a long way since 2013.
Yeah.
Or at least my cultural awareness as a white person has come a long way since 2013. Like, reading about this, and, like, Emma shared this great video from Push to Smart that kind of, like, went through Daisy's arc a little. And this idea of it being like, well, violence is never acceptable in the context of this, like, hyper-violent game, and, you know, couched in this world of extreme inequality that mirrors the inequality of our world, just in a hyper manner, basically. Yeah. Does hit uncomfortably close to that kind of, like, well, I can't condone rioting and looting kind of last summer, and that doesn't sit well with me in 2021. I think in a way that maybe I wouldn't have noticed as much in 2013.
Yeah,
like, I definitely point out that the games can be exaggerated, and, like, murder in a game doesn't mean that you condone murder. In the real world.
And I think you see that same sort of cultural perception in terms of Bioshock Infinite was received really positively at the time it came out, but now that when you read, like, modern articles, it's definitely a lot more polarized in terms of people still love it, people are more skeptical of it, people are mixed on it. Possibly even more than The Last of Us. Possibly.
Yeah, like, as someone who hasn't played it, it's like, I would like to see more people taking these kinds of risks.
I mean, right? Columbia is a great, as a setting, like, you come out into it and you look around and you're like, yeah, like, this is a great satirical exaggeration of where America, the idea of America, would go. And it's just disappointing that it doesn't, like, do anything with it, right? Because it gets sort of wrapped up in this separate, you know, still compelling, but very separate, like, sci-fi plot that Booker and Elizabeth find themselves in. You do fight mechanized George Washington also. So that's also good, I guess. But it does feel like they in some ways it feels like they picked an aesthetic and then just like forgot
put the game they already had into it.
Yeah.
Well, I hope somebody else takes a shot at that. That's that kind of satirical critique is something that I think could actually succeed, if only because, the gamers that don't want to interrogate it can just be like, haha, God, George Washington, that's funny.
Yeah.
But the people that do, it'll be there.
Yeah. Yeah, the first Bioshock is like, it gets around having to critique its like Ayn Rand society by having it already have destroyed itself by the time your protagonist gets there. So you like, people will still take it and be like, Rapture's cool. But it's pretty, like, you get there and it's already fallen to pieces because that sort of society isn't sustainable. When you get to Columbia, it's like, fine. And really it falls apart because Booker's there with his, like, windmill saw arm murdering things.
Maybe that's a critique of America as well. In the end, the man with the gun will come for us all. I do want to talk about Wolfenstein real quick before we talk about we can close with the army.
Sure.
Army's a good closer.
Sure.
So on the kind of the other end of extremely not real games that deal with America. Mm-hmm. What a genre there. It's a Metroidvania and also an extremely not real game dealing with America. So the Wolfenstein series, right, if you're familiar with it, takes place in an alternate future where the Axis won World War II and America has been taken over by Nazis.
Yeah.
An alternate future, I said, where America has been taken over by Nazis.
Yes.
As opposed to 2021. So you might remember, I remember this because it was like taking place right as we were starting the podcast, and I was like starting to be aware of video games again. But Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus, came out in 2017, and there was a big controversy around their ad that said, "Make America Nazi-free again." Mm-hmm. Which is, when I call out those Call of Duty gamers, that's who I'm talking about. But Wolfenstein 2 kind of brings an interesting take on the American exceptionalism narrative because, like, it's definitely still promoting that ideology, but it does it in a way that is much more palatable to me. In that, I think, going back to what you talked about American exceptionalism not necessarily being about, like, America is amazing now, but about the potential, I feel like Wolfenstein 2 digs in hard to, like, even if America sucks now, like, it can be great because there's, like, something there. So what happens here, right, is America is Nazi-occupied. A lot of Americans have become, like, cartoonishly awful Nazis, including our hero, B.J. Blazkowicz. I love that name for him. Him. He's not a cartoonishly bad Nazi. His father is a cartoonishly bad Nazi.
They do. His name is, like, he's coded as Jewish, which is sort of relevant too.
Well, his mother is Jewish.
Yes, exactly.
And so the Nazis in this game are horrible.
Yeah.
Right? Like, this is not a subtle depiction. I mean, not that you see very many subtle depictions of Nazis in any American media.
No.
Nor should you necessarily. But this is not subtle even on that scale. Just obviously horrible enemies, which you kind of have to justify the gameplay of Wolfenstein, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you're going to be mowing down American Nazis, they had better be irredeemable, right?
Yeah.
Unless you want a game that has much more complex moral calculus, then I think this kind of first-person shooter can really sustain while still being quote-unquote fun. But ultimately, like, BJ Blazkowicz is still, like, an American patriot. And even though, like, there are people in the characters in these games that are like, well, the US government was already racist and oppressive and, like, even before the Nazis, right?
Yeah.
But, like, BJ's patriotism kind of wins out, and his belief in, like, the American experiment wins out. And so, like, in a lot of ways, this is the exact same propaganda message as any of the more realistic games, right? That America is special no matter what.
Yeah.
But, like, somehow, for me, like, it doesn't make me want to vomit in the same way. And that's definitely because I've been indoctrinated. Like, I'm fully indoctrinated. Like, I'll throw that out there. That somewhere in my brain is that kernel that, like, America is special, even if I believe in it in the way that's like, no, America, like, can be great. I mean, case in point, BJ Blazkowicz dies, gets beheaded in front of the Capitol, and then his head gets grafted onto a Nazi super soldier, and he goes back for revenge. So, like, yeah, you know what? America is great.
But yeah, it is the sort of, and this isn't to say that you should, like, fall into nihilism or pessimism and say, like, oh, this place can never be fixed, so why bother trying? Because that's just as dangerous a mindset as really wholeheartedly believing in the American dream. But just recently, you'll get people like Joe Biden and his administration being like, this is not America, you know? Like, this is not what America stands for. And it's like, kind of is, though. It kind of is, though. And, you know, what they're trying to say is there's this idealized America, this America founded on, you know, the wise principles of a bunch of white dudes is some greater place. But it's hard to feel rallied by that when it just seems so, you know, tone deaf. But in a country that it would, in the theoretical country of Wolfenstein that is just overrun with the literal out and proud Nazis, not even just on Twitter, like, just, they're out
not
there.
Not even just Twitter is overrun.
Like, it's a lot.
It's not just half of YouTube.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to believe in that message because you're like, no, we're not that bad, you know, but in some ways, maybe we are, you know? I don't know.
I think we're still ahead of the Wolfenstein 2 folks, if only by a nose.
I do think it's really interesting, these, like, alternate takes on World War II, where, like, the Axis power one, especially the modern ones, are always, like, very focused on Germany again, and, like, not even touching Japan with, like, a 10-foot pole. I guess, because that part of the war is a lot more complicated, and also we got all of our fear of Japan out in, like, the 80s, I guess.
Well, except the PS2.
With, like, Cyberpunk. Oh yeah, fun fact. No, China's our new, like, country Asia boogeyman, so we don't have to be afraid of Japan anymore. But fun fact, in March of 2000, the release of Sony's new PlayStation 2, the Japanese government classified the game console as a general-purpose product related to conventional weapons because it was powerful enough to be used for an actual missile guidance system. What is my PlayStation 5 powerful enough to do? Is my question.
I don't know, man. That's some Ender's Game stuff.
So they used the Foreign Exchange and Foreign Trade Control Law to regulate a game console, and PlayStation had to get, like, special licenses to distribute. Meanwhile, the U.S. military was designing the Dragon Runner, a unmanned remote control reconnaissance truck whose controller was modeled after the PlayStation 2 because they figured that incoming soldiers would already be partially trained to use it. This is from Have you played the War on Terror from Stahl in 20...
I take it the controller was modeled after the DualShock, not after the PlayStation 2.
Yes, the PlayStation controller is what I meant.
I mean, it just would be funny if the army was like, here it is. It's this black brick. And this is the controller.
I don't remember what topic we talked about this on, but we definitely talked a little bit about... Maybe it was like YouTube and Twitch. We did like an episode on that. But
oh, yeah, we talked about streaming.
Yeah.
This is...
But that's still... The U.S. Army is still very interested in bringing on gamers.
Well, I didn't realize that they have a literal esports team.
Yeah.
I thought they were just hanging out on Twitch, but I didn't realize that there are army dudes who play video games 13 hours a day.
They do also just hang out on Twitch. It's not like their esports team is streaming every time they're streaming. But yeah, they have a literal esports team.
The guys in the video said that they stream every day from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m., which, frankly, maybe I'd rather be deployed.
No talk of war crimes in the chat. Thank you.
Usually that's good manners. But, yeah. Like, there are plenty of Discords where I think it would be fine to be like, yeah, guys, we're not going to talk about war crimes. And people be like, yeah, I guess not. Like, I don't think war crimes are appropriate for my Stardew Valley Discord. You're absolutely right. Let's ban that.
Yes. The important thing is in the Discord, as long as they enforce it wholeheartedly. You can't talk about war crimes. It's not that you can say war crimes didn't happen. You gotta make sure that that's how they're interpreting the rule. Because sometimes they aren't. You know? Oops.
But yeah, they are using... This video was disturbing to me.
Yeah.
Disturbing in how brilliant and effective it definitely is. And, like, how obviously smart about what they're doing here the guy that was, like, talking about it the most was. I don't know, like, obviously they are still, like, bungling a lot of it. The war crimes ban thing, case in point. But, like, there are some brains behind this that know what they're doing and are doing it effectively, in that they are dangling the carrot of being on an esports team in front of these... Look, I'm just gonna say it. Like Emma should put the YouTube clip in the Oh, I don't know. Maybe you shouldn't put the YouTube clip. I would not want anyone to see it and be like, yeah, I want to do that.
Yeah.
So let me make it clear that, like, if Emma puts this YouTube clip in the thing, like, you should not do this. And hopefully the video will convince you of this, because, like, they're dangling this carrot of this 16-person army esports team in front of these, like, pretty much exclusively young white men at this... like, these, like, convention things. That's not true. One of the men they talked to was not white in the interview, but, like, the pictures of it, it's like, oh, my high school. But, like, 6,500 people tried out for this team, and 16 made it. And those other 6,484 dudes are still in the army.
Yeah.
They don't get to say... I didn't make the esports team, so I don't want to be in the army anymore. Yeah. That is what surprised me. I did not realize that they were literally dangling that carrot as a recruitment tool in front of people. I thought it was like, they're on Twitch because that's where the youth are, and they're a little bit ahead of the curve on the American government in terms of, like, being on Twitch, where these young, impressionable people are, right? I didn't realize it was literally, like, join the army and play games. I mean, I guess that's better than, like, you like shooters? You'll love the army. Like...
They still definitely do some stuff like that. I know. I go to, like, sites, like, IGN is really guilty of this a lot. And not the journalists necessarily, but the people in charge of, like, putting
selling the
sponsored content. As, like, this is sponsored by the U.S. Army. I'm like, oh, neat. No. Or they'll have, like, you know, like, generals or their lieutenants on to, like, play video games and, like, talk about it on these, like, game sites. It's very uncomfortable for me to see that happening.
I'd like to see other, like, civil service. Like, I'd like to see, like, the Department of Labor.
Yeah.
The Department of Health and Human Services. Like, I feel like If we're gonna let the army
They play some life sim games.
Like, you know, I saw, like, you know, AOC and etc. like wanting to ban the army from Twitch, I think is well intentioned, but
it's not possible.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know how you would do that. It's un-American. But to me, it seems like the solution is, let's get every branch of the U.S. Like, let's have the Supreme Court have an esports team.
Yeah, you don't pick jurors anymore. They have to try out and do like a Smash Bros tournament, and whoever wins is the new Supreme Court Justice for life.
No, it's Ace Attorney. It's speedruns of Ace Attorney.
Oh my god.
But no, seriously, I did, for a moment, they were playing something else. For a moment, I thought the guy on there was streaming Hades. There was one thing that, like, looked like Hades to me for half a frame, and I was like, that's weird. Like, I hope Supergiant knows about this. Like, yikes. But it wasn't Hades.
Good. I'm glad.
Yeah, my proposal is let's get a lot of companies on Twitch. That sounds great. Everyone's gonna love that, right? Like, let's get a lot more government channels.
Yes.
On Twitch.
Happy 4th of July! Boom, 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 boom.
Boom, 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 boom.
Play that Bruce Springsteen song that's definitely about critiquing America, but we play it on the 4th every year anyway. Boom, boom, boom,
Born in the USA.
Yeah. Next week.
The most American game of all will be Nintendogs 2, which is just Nintendogs 2 4th of July.
Yes.
And it's just your dog freaking out.
Yes.
As fireworks go off.
Exactly. Next week we're talking about Nights into Dreams and Umurangi Generation. So look forward to that. But Madeline, do you want to give the spiel to
You betcha.
close us out?
Folks, if you like Talk This, if you buy into the ideology of Talk This, you should check us out on social media, even though we just said on social media that social media is dominated by Nazis. But hey, you should check us out on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. At Talk This Podcast. Now that you've listened to this podcast, you're probably going to get ads from the U.S. Army.
Oh, no.
Because probably Army is mentioned in the blog that you clicked to get here.
Oops.
And so now you're targeted. You're welcome. You should also check out our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where we can guarantee no patriotic advertisements. And no advertisements at all. Where you can read all about the show, check out the games that are in the hat, and read our blog. So lots of bloggy blogs. Finally, and most importantly, if you really want to get that, sweet hit of Talk This every week, you should subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Cast, anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find Talk This. I hope this episode was worth us now being on the FBI watch list. We're like, happy 4th of July. Soldier games are bad.
Well, do you want to sign us off before they bust down our doors?
This week, I hope the only crimes that Ronald Reagan orders you to commit are stopping people from setting off fireworks that upset your dog.